A thin October sun cut through slate clouds and splashed across the battered windshield of Sarah's rusted Ford. She watched the winter landscape unravel, pine forests slipping into bare meadows, while the road twisted deeper into Montana's forgotten hinterlands. Every mile felt heavier, as if she was driving not toward a house, but away from the entire life she'd built and lost. The divorce papers, and signed, lay somewhere in her purse, alongside a layoff notice, crumpled receipts, and a $40 grocery voucher, the last relics of a vanished city existence. She gripped the steering wheel with numb fingers, steering off a gravel turn marked only by a bullet-riddled sign, Silver Point. The village itself was all but invisible, drowned by overgrown weeds and broken picket fences. A hush seemed to roam the place. Sarah's new property, the fixer-upper with potential, appeared after a row of dead birches, a squat, battered house whose shingles hung loose like molted feathers. She pulled up, killed the engine, and exhaled, not relief, not excitement, but something closer to surrender. Stepping out, the chill clung to her bones, seeping through jeans and parka. The keys barely turned in the front door, wood bloated and warped by years of neglect. Inside, darkness pressed in from every corner. The air smelled of moisture and rot, acrid and old. Each breath burned her nostrils as she stepped further in and froze. Mountains of garbage bags loomed in every room. They spilled across the warped wooden floor, bumping against broken chairs, sagging tables, drifts of yellowed newspaper. The kitchen door was off its hinges, the sink hanging crooked below a window, smeared with the greasy memory of sun. Every step stirred a swirl of dust and mold, flakes catching weak sunlight that crept through the ruined panes. Sarah set down her duffel and tried to quiet her rapid heartbeat. The walls themselves seemed to sigh under the weight of years, water stains tracing brown veins above the radiators, a black patch of mold blooming behind the fridge. The living room was no better. Half the ceiling had collapsed, its beams bowed like old men beneath snow. She walked through each room, counting up disasters. The bathroom tiles were spiderwebbed with cracks. In the tub, rust-colored stains told silent stories of leaks gone untended for decades. The bedroom windows were broken, shards crunching under her boots as she stepped over them. There was no sign of heat, nor any hope of fixing it before winter struck for real. Even breathing felt treacherous, each lungful heavy with mildew and regret. For an endless moment, Sarah stood there, her head spinning, not just from exhaustion, but the staggering reality of what she'd bought with her last reserves. She hadn't simply run away. She'd run into ruin, bought her own personal mausoleum. The soft crunch of gravel on the driveway broke the silence. Sarah moved to the kitchen window, peeking through a gap in the blinds. An old pickup truck idled outside, exhaust curling into the air. A woman climbed out, tall and broad-shouldered, skin weathered and eyes sharp above a scarf. Sarah recognized her. Margaret Doyle, the one neighbor the realtor had mentioned. Silver Point's last watcher. Margaret didn't approach timidly. She stomped across the porch and rapped on the door with a blunt end of snow shovel. Sarah, nerves jangling, opened the door halfway. "You the new owner?" Margaret barked. Sarah nodded. "Don't leave your doors open. Wolves come down from the mountains in October. Last season, 6 sheep vanished before first snow. Are they dangerous?" Sarah managed. Margaret snorted. "Any animal's dangerous when it's hungry." Before Sarah could thank her, Margaret was gone, the pickup rattling off down the lane. Sarah closed the door and lingered in the entryway, replaying Margaret's warning. Wolves. Not just her own loneliness to contend with now, but a shadow that prowled beyond these ramshackle walls. She forced herself to move, gathering armfuls of plastic bags and dragging them outside. The garbage was disconcertingly light, mostly faded clothes with moth holes, tax returns dated from the 80s, and battered toys. One bag split in her hands, spilling out old baby shoes and a cracked picture frame. Glass gone and face faded to phantom. Inside, neat stacks of junk hinted at past lives. A wood-handled hammer beside a handwritten recipe for apple pie, a jar of buttons mixed with coins too dull to buy anything. Sarah felt the weight of stories trapped in silent objects, the ghost of laughter in empty rooms. Fatigue pressed upon her, but a different kind first, a psychological exhaustion as memories of her old city life unfurled. The memory of a heated apartment, coffee in the mornings looking out from a fifth-story window, nights spent scrolling through job boards, arguing gently with Ben, her ex, in the kitchen until anger gave way to silence. Here, standing knee-deep in someone else's ruin, the contrast was vicious and sharp. The hours faded behind thickening clouds as Sarah kept sorting trash, quietly resigning herself to the day's cold, to the echo of warnings. The closed door at the end of the hall, half concealed by debris and shadow, was all that remained unexplored. She would wait until sunset, she decided. The last light slipped from the walls, leaving her with a single working lamp perched on a pile of old National Geographics. She drank a cup of lukewarm tea, her last packet, and watched the closed door, a faint scratching emanating from behind. It came and went, soft at first, then growing louder. Not a consistent rhythm, but an intermittent desperation. What's behind that door? Sarah asked herself. Raccoons? Rats? Something else. Something that carried the rumors Margaret had dropped like pebbles in a still pond. The hook had embedded itself in Sarah's mind. Fear warred with curiosity. Each time she resolved to open the door, her feet refused, her hands trembling just enough that she kept busy elsewhere. When she finally moved closer, step by step, across the battered rug, her heart thudded so violently she felt sick. She laid a hand on the doorknob, feeling the cold metal bite through her skin. The hush of the house was complete, the kind of silence that only exists in places abandoned for too long. Beyond the closed door, the scratching faded away, replaced by an absolute stillness. Sarah braced herself for whatever might come next, her breath shallow, her mind whirling. Last hope tangled with a certainty that something beyond explanation lurked just beyond. Sarah stood with her palm pressed against the door, the late autumn chill sliding off the faded paint into her bones. In the dim lamplight, the mountain of garbage bags behind her seemed to fade into insignificance. Nothing mattered except this barrier, this threshold marked by the unknown. For a moment, she hesitated, the silence weighing heavy on her chest. The whisper of memory drifted back. Her apartment in Seattle, always overheated. Mornings with coffee, sunlight glimmering across clean counters. Here and now, the contrast blasted through her. City comforts replaced by rot, nostalgia crushed by need. She closed her eyes, recalling nights of restless sleep after the divorce, days spent staring at blinking cursors and emails with no reply, hands trembling over job applications that led nowhere. A life lost. Now perhaps another life waiting on the other side of this doorway. She twisted the knob, stiff, resisting, finally yielding with a sigh. The door creaked, open a few inches. At first, only darkness stared back, then movement. A dull reflection off cracked linoleum, shadow shifting at the far end, and suddenly the unmistakable smell of old fur and fear, thick enough to taste. Her eyes adjusted gradually. Along the left wall, bags of refuse were pushed back, revealing a narrow path. In the center, broken furniture leaned toward each other, forming jagged silhouettes. But it was the origin of the sound, a small, desperate noise, unmistakably animal, that held her gaze. She saw them, old suitcases jumbled in a pile, and among them, the fragile shapes of previous occupants' forgotten belongings, a lamp, a mirror, a row of yellowed books. Her heart hammered. From the depths, movement again. The scratching intensified, a shadow curled and stretched, living muscles under matted fur. She caught a glimpse, half of a torn blanket, a kitchen stool tipped against the wall in a casual barricade. The source of the sound emerged. Pale little paws, thin limbs, and big, curious eyes. A stray cat, a raccoon, a fox. Her mind wound through options while her body stayed petrified. She stepped forward, breath shallow. The air tasted different here. Less the stale, stinking rot of the front rooms. More wild, raw. Something alive. Her boot nudged a broken lamp, sending shards tinkling across the floor, and the sound in the dark paused instantly. Then, almost imperceptibly, came another noise, a low, throaty whimper, followed by sharp, frantic scratching. Sarah's heart leapt. She saw movement behind the heap of trash, a flash of russet fur, trembling with every breath. Her nerves screamed retreat, but she stayed, hands clenched at her sides. The animal, she could see now, was small, but not helpless, its eyes glowing in the weak lamplight, confronting the intruder with wary resolve. It pressed itself against the corner, alert and vulnerable. With slow, careful steps, Sarah made her way around the old mattress and shattered picture frames. The animal's head jerked, tracking every move. For a moment, she was certain it would bolt, but the way it crouched screamed exhaustion more than aggression. That exhaustion she understood intimately. The garbage bags thudded as she pushed aside another pile. The whimpering returned, urgent but faint, echoing off the battered walls. Now, more than ever, the house felt like a living wound, each room a scar carved by abandonment. She knelt and reached forward, palm open and steady, the world narrowing to a corridor of hope and dread. The animal shivered, its breath shallow, its body pulled taut as wire. And yet, as Sarah held her posture, a strange calmness swept over her, fear melting into quiet determination. Behind the creature, she now saw the remains of a nest, torn blankets layered atop old cardboard, a lopsided cushion, and, her breath caught, a scattering of small bones, long since picked clean. The animal was not alone. A series of faint mews and the stutter of movement revealed a litter of kittens, huddled together for warmth. Sarah's thoughts spun wild, balancing fear for their survival against her own safety. Wolves, Margaret had warned, but these were not wolves, at least not yet. The fragility of life, so raw and exposed, demanded response. Slowly, gently, she retreated. The animal's gaze followed her, unwavering, even as she stood. Sarah closed the door, the weight of possibility pressing in, a choice not yet made, but looming. In the living room, the relics of past owners stared up at her. She gathered old newspapers and fashion magazines, piecing together decades, stories of snowstorms, birth announcements, faded photographs of hunting parties. The world outside, with its pack of silent houses and ever-hungry wolves, felt impossibly near. She flipped open one book, its spine broken, a wild guide to local wildlife. Wolves, apex predators, misunderstood survivors. Their stories interwoven with rural legend, protectors and threats, symbols of loneliness and family. Sarah traced her fingers over faded illustrations, feeling the ache of ancient questions. What is the line between exile and sanctuary, between closing the door and crossing the threshold? Outside, night pressed close, the wind rattling through broken windows, shaping wild patterns in the dust. Sarah waited until exhaustion demanded sleep, huddling under a thin blanket on a sagging couch, listening to the late October wind singing of pack and peril, of home remade from ruin. She drifted into fitful dreams filled with echoing footsteps, cries lost to moonlit woods, and doors that might yet open. Sarah awoke before dawn, her sleep broken and uncertain, haunted by images of furtive movement and watchful animal eyes. In the gray gloom, the house seemed even lonelier. Shadows pressed against rotting walls. The wind whistled through cracks in the glass with a voice reminiscent of distant howls. Every instinct in her rebelled at reopening the door at the end of the hall, but curiosity lingered, fighting dread. She dressed in layers, old thermal underwear, patched jeans, Ben's flannel shirt, and a faded army surplus parka she'd found at a thrift store for $8. Each garment was a thin defense against not only the Montana cold, but the world she'd found herself in, abruptly cut off from city comfort. In the kitchen, she brewed the last of her store-brand coffee, watching as the sunrise edged the eastern sky with pale yellow streaks. She grabbed whatever food she could spare, half a rotisserie chicken left over from her solitary dinner, a can of cheap dog food, a plastic bowl for water. The idea of feeding a trapped animal rather than calling for help seemed reckless, but she'd made her decision in the deep hours of the night. She had to know who, or what, needed her inside that room. The house was silent except for her footsteps and the constant whisper of wind through broken window frames. She walked the ruined hallway, feeling the floor sway under her boots. The closer she got to the door, the sharper her senses became. Was it really just a stray cat or fox she had seen in the dimness, like her mind had tried to convince her? The memory of the warning, wolves come down from the mountains, kept her at the edge of fear. She set the plate and bowl on the floor, steadying herself before turning the knob. The door swung inward with a long, slow groan, its protest echoing through silent spaces. Cold air spilled out, mingling with the faint smell of animal and decay. At first, nothing moved. Sarah's heart pounded, echoing in her ears. She crouched, her eyes adjusting, catching pieces of a scene carved in midnight and dust. Then, across the expanse of broken linoleum, in the deep-shadowed corner beneath the window, a shape unfolded itself slowly, warily. A wolf, not a dog, not a coyote, not anything domesticated, a full-grown gray wolf, her coat mottled where dirt and old blood clung to pale fur, muscles trembling with tension. 3 tiny pups, fragile, unsure, were pressed against her belly, their heads lifting and falling as they nursed and cried in mewling unison. For a breathless moment, Sarah was frozen. The air thickened with primal warning as the wolf's amber eyes fixed on her. The world outside shrank away. The mother's lips curled, teeth flashed behind whiskers, a rumbling growl vibrating through the floorboards. Sarah's mind scrambled for solutions. Call animal control, contact a rescue agency, shout for the neighbor. She realized with a wrenching certainty that intervention meant death for the mother and likely the pups. Words Margaret had whispered now pulsed in her head. They'd shoot her. Wolves weren't pets. They weren't even welcome in these parts. She saw the wound on the hind leg, a jagged gash, fur slick and rotten, skin purpled around the edges. The room was a prison, defended only by broken furniture and a window too small for escape. The wolf's eyes burned with a message. She would fight with every muscle to protect her young, but she could not flee. The pups squeaked in helpless hunger, their voices bouncing off cracked walls. Sarah dared to take a step forward, hands lifted above her waist, making herself as small as possible, trying to mimic mercy. The wolf tensed, bones showing in the hollow spaces beneath her pelt, but she did not strike. "I'm not here to hurt you," Sarah whispered. Her voice trembled, echoing old fear into the silent room. A minute passed, or perhaps only seconds, stretched thick with tension. With an agonizing exhale, Sarah placed a plate just inside the threshold and retreated, keeping her gaze lowered, never turning her back until she reached the hallway again. The door closed, a deliberate boundary, a symbol, a promise not yet fulfilled. She listened. The mother wolf's movements inside were wary. Her claws clicked over linoleum, her soft, cautionary whine mixed with the shuffling of her pups. Nothing happened for a long time. Then the sounds changed. She heard the bowl nudged, the click of teeth on bone, small gulps, and quiet snuffling. Sarah pressed her ear against the cracked wood, heart pounding. The wolf wasn't attacking. She was surviving. The realization unfurled inside Sarah. A new kind of hope, sharp and painful, born of a need to save and be saved in turn. She retreated. In the haze of morning, she scoured the house for more clues. Books left behind by previous owners, papers and diaries hidden in drawers, a wildlife guide dusty and annotated by hand. She sank into the battered armchair, reading by the pale light, learning the language of wolves. Dangerous, loyal, protective, desperate. Most of all, she read that a mother would not eat unless her young could also feed. The injury, the hunger, the isolation, these were battles Sarah had fought, if not in body, then in soul. She turned back to the closed door, heavy with dread and resolution. If she called for help, the mother would die and her pups would be orphaned. If she did nothing, the wound would fester, and the little family would quietly fade away in silence and shadow. The conflict raged in her chest, fear bruising up against compassion, survival against the possibility of doing something right for once. She resolved to try, to find any way, however clumsy or foolish, to change the outcome. She left food at the door for the rest of the day, each gesture careful, quiet, deliberate. And each time, the silence inside the room softened, the growls faded, replaced by the sounds of cautious hope. Night pressed in with a forceful intimacy, settling on Silver Point like an old regret. Sarah sat motionless in the kitchen, the battered wildlife guide open across her knees. Words ran together. Canis lupus, territory, den, trauma, each phrase tinged with stories of survival and violence. She tried to fit her own panic within the taxonomy. A mother driven to desperation, a human unduly entrusted with the outcome. The lamplight circled her hands as she fumbled through the cupboards, repurposing dusty cans and brittle boxes. She assembled a feast, canned beans she would never touch, a half-pack of dried beef, leftover bread from Margaret's last pity visit. Every scrap, placed carefully, as if ritual could bridge the gap between her world and the wild one caged at the end of the hallway. She scanned the room for answers left by the house's previous occupants. Scrawled vet notes in the margins of a dog owner's manual. A faded prescription for antibiotics. Anatomy diagrams for cleaning wounds, as if the structure itself remembered a time when animals had been valued as friends. Sarah felt blindly for hope. Maybe she could do something, and maybe that would mean she hadn't thrown her life away after all. The tension built as she approached the wolf's room, balancing the offering in her arms. Her every step announced her presence, the subtle tremor in her limbs betraying apprehension. She set the food down on the threshold, the water bowl beside it, and retreated several paces. What followed was a vigil, minutes stretching, heartbeat echoing in ears. She peered through the narrow crack in the door, careful not to meet the wolf's gaze directly. Inside, the mother wolf lingered at the edge of shadow, torn between hunger and wariness. She nosed the water, sniffed the bread, ignored the beans. The pups, soft and boneless, mewed feebly. Sarah watched as the wolf crept forward, each movement deliberate and full of warning. Her wounded leg dragged against the floor, spasming with effort. The wolf considered the food, then paused, eyes flickering across Sarah's silhouette in the hallway. The silence resolved. Would the wolf trust, or would self-preservation win out? Finally, the mother wolf snatched a scrap of dried beef and retreated to the rear wall. She placed it at the pup's feet, letting them gnaw and whimper. The remaining food went untouched, a message as clear as any shouted threat. Sarah realized that hunger was compounding the injury, her maternal instinct overwhelming even her own survival. The wolf would starve, feeding the pups, burning what strength remained. It was a pattern Sarah knew too well. She'd starve herself of joy, giving everything to Ben until he'd left her empty, worn down by responsibilities and unresolved pain. She pressed her forehead to cold plaster, fighting the urge to break down. The conflict inside her raged. Should she call for help, let strangers end the wolf's suffering cleanly, or risk everything to keep this fragile family alive? She saw herself reflected in the wolf's desperation, risk and tenderness intertwined, both caught in a storm of choices that had no easy answer. Sarah spent late evening scouring the internet for answers, her phone barely managing a signal, pages loading with excruciating slowness. The advice tasted of uncertainty. Do not approach a wounded adult wolf. Leave food at a distance. Never interfere with a mother and her pups. Trust must be earned in silence. She watched the wolf's silhouette through the crack as darkness thickened. The animal's head lowered, nose twitching every time Sarah moved. The wounded paw was swollen, ringed with pus she could see glistening in faint moonlight. The pups slept curled against their mother's belly, the wolf never relaxing, her body a barricade between invader and young. Sarah returned to the battered armchair, her own body curled inward. Hours passed. The lamp flickered. The wind carried loose bits of roof away. She was left with the memory of eyes, the wolf's, mirrors of her own despair. In small, ritualized steps, Sarah continued her experiment. She whispered quietly through the door whenever she left food, hoping her voice would become familiar, less a threat and more a sign of intention. Sometimes she sang, a handful of lullabies remembered from her childhood, lyrics broken by emotion. The wolf responded only with silence, a tension that both soothed and unsettled. The day became night, then morning again, as Sarah tried everything she knew. She sketched a plan in her journal, pencil trembling, fine peroxide. Make a muzzle from old belts. Source antibiotics in town. Never make sharp movements. The hope was fragile. Even one misstep could drive the wolf into violence, shatter the tenuous bridge of trust she was trying to build. By sunrise, Sarah was determined. She would help, slowly, step by step, honoring the line between caution and compassion. As she sat outside the wolf's door, listening to the low stirrings within, she resolved there would be no more running, no more retreat. The threshold had become a promise. And on the other side, 3 tiny, hungry pups waited for their world to begin again. Sarah awoke shivering, her breath forming pale clouds in the half-lit room. The sky outside the kitchen window was a slab of silver shot through with streaks of pink, the kind of morning Montana offered up only at the very edge of autumn, before it surrendered the land to winter's iron grip. She pulled her sleeves down over her knuckles and tried to massage life into her fingers, searching for something to anchor herself in this endless string of cold dawns. Her legs dragged as she moved toward the stove where yesterday's embers clung to decaying warmth. There were only a few logs left. She'd need to chop more if she wanted the house to stay livable for another day. Sarah assembled breakfast on the fly. 2 remaining eggs cooked over a sputtering flame, a handful of dry cereal, the last flashes of creamy coffee swirling in her chipped mug. On the counter, scraps of last night's dinner, bits of chicken, bone, and gristle, waited beside a battered bowl. These she wrapped in a napkin and carried along the chilly corridor toward the wolf's room. Her steps fell as quietly as possible, listening always for the subtle change in sound, the way the air thickened, the hush after a mother's warning growl echoed off crude paneling. At the door, she paused. The memory of yesterday, her own trembling hand, the wolf's measured retreat, the wary circling of trust, had settled inside her, mixing dread with resolve. The conflict weighed her down. Each movement carried the silent question. Was she helping or simply gambling with hope grown thin as ice? She crouched and untied the bundle, arranging the food and fresh water at the door. Not inside, never inside, not yet. She backed away, settling beside the threshold, the bowl of water grasped loosely in her hands. This morning, she chose not to look through the crack, but to stay present, visible but non-threatening, letting her voice carry a thread of calm. "You need food, sweetheart," she murmured softly. "You need it more than I do, and you need water even more." For a time, nothing happened. Shadows shifted. The floor creaked as she shifted her weight, never daring a sudden movement. From within came the muffled whimpers of the pups, 3 distinctive voices now, their hunger sharper, their bodies larger, their play more assertive. The wolf approached cautiously, her gait uneven, favoring the inflamed leg. Sarah winced to see fresh swelling, a dull redness accentuated by the raw shine of pus. The mother lapped at the water, then turned her attention to the chicken. But she did not feed herself. Instead, she dragged meat toward her pups, nudging it into the heap of torn blankets where they waited, mouths open in blind, expectant squalls. Sarah watched, heart torn by the quiet sacrifice. The wolf had grown thin, ribs mapped cuffs of shadow along her side, shoulders hunched beneath the weight of worry. Even as she licked her own wounds, attention kept sweeping over the brood, eyes flickering between Sarah and the little forms whose survival defined every choice she'd made. It was this moment, Sarah realized, when the line between fear and connection began to blur, challenged by something older than words, the pure, unyielding devotion of a mother determined to save her young. Sarah stayed by the door, silent and patient, while the wolf finished feeding her pups. 3 tiny mouths snapped and sucked, fighting for every scrap. The mother watched Sarah as she cleaned the wound as best she could with old blankets and her own rough tongue. She was weaker this morning, slower, less apt to snarl, less prone to defend. The room's temperature held little mercy. Each breath Sarah took stung with cold, and yet she still could not leave. She simply wrapped the silence around herself, whispering fragments of stories, tracing the evolution of a strange friendship built on tension and cautious observation. She pulled out her phone as gently as possible, mustering enough signal to search for advice. Infected wolf wounds, field remedies, Montana veterinary contacts, antibiotic salve for wild canids. Each result was a reminder of isolation. Help too far away, answers always out of reach. If she couldn't approach, she'd have to wait for trust to thaw. In the meantime, Sarah made herself a fixture beside the door. Morning after morning, she sat, speaking softly, almost to herself, never demanding, never threatening. She told tales of city life, spun nonsense about skyscrapers and coffee shops. Sometimes she sang, her voice frail with fatigue, notes swallowed by ancient paneling. Routines formed. The wolf learned to recognize the rhythm of Sarah's passing, the inflections of her voice, the deliberate, slow gestures. She stopped growling as sharply, her eyes less burdened by raw panic. The air in the room thickened with a tentative hope, each day built upon the last. A wall of trust, brick by careful brick. Sarah noticed that while the wolf ate almost nothing, she always made certain the pups fed first. She observed their play, the way one bold pup, large and silver-furred, tackled his siblings with tumbling enthusiasm. The second, a hesitant mix of brown and cream, preferred the safety of corners, pouncing only when encouraged. The smallest wolf, nearly black, became Sarah's favorite, always first to approach, always last to retreat, eyes wide and curious as constellations. By noon the sunlight slipped further over the mountain, shadows deepening, temperatures drooping toward the promise of snow. Sarah watched through thin light for the telltale signs of worsening infection. The wolf chewed on her raised paw between feedings, a deep, desperate motion, whimpers escaping in intervals. Sarah retreated, her own body aching from hours on cold linoleum. That afternoon, she pored over the battered veterinary manual again, making lists, sketching plans, rationing food scraps. The knowledge she was running out of time pressed her onward, desperate for solutions that required trust she had not yet claimed. She watched, day after day, as the wolf's reactions shifted. Growls faded to warning whines, then to wary silence. Sarah spent hours each afternoon outside the door, not as a threat, but as an anchor. She noticed how the wolf's ears flicked toward her voice, how the pups crept closer to the crack, noses working overtime to catch the unfamiliar scent. One late afternoon, Sarah leaned against the wall, too exhausted for stories or song. She simply sat. Silence settled, heavy and grateful, as dusk brushed the window with dark blue. The mother wolf, spent from the day, looked at Sarah, just looked for a long moment, then tucked her brooding close and surrendered to rest. In that fragile pause, Sarah understood the weight of what she had begun. The first bridge had been built, not of words or bargains, but of presence. Loneliness had met loneliness across an old threshold. Neither woman nor wolf was alone anymore. Night came early, the windows veiled with breath and ice crystals, obscuring the last glimmers of day. Sarah stacked blankets by the fireplace, coaxing reluctant flames from the meager remnants of her woodpile. The house groaned in the cold, as if mourning the passing of the season. She sat wrapped in layers, scribbling frantic notes in her battered journal, timelines of feedings, observations of the wolf's injury, possibilities she could pursue with a stable internet connection. Air from the wolf's room felt colder. She wondered if the unheated space was making the infection worse. Feeling a surge of responsibility, a guilt grown wild, Sarah composed herself, carrying a flashlight, a bowl of water, and more scraps out of her kitchen to the door once again. She paused, hand hovering above the knob, throat tight with resolve. Margaret's warnings had returned, ghost-like, mingling with the jagged worries of her own city upbringing. Here there were no animal hospitals at the end of the block, no ready answers, only improvisation and a stubborn will to endure. She knocked gently, a new type of greeting, the sound soft, nearly musical in the stillness. "It's Sarah," she whispered. "I'm here. You're not alone." From inside, a low whine, part hunger, part recognition. Sarah opened the door just wide enough to place the food and water, flicking the flashlight beam over the forms just inside. The mother wolf was awake, amber eyes catching the light. Her breath steamed in the room's chill. The pups scrabbled over each other, tangled in their nest of rags and torn quilts. Sarah counted again. 3, still 3, growing with each day, hunger sharpening bones but leaving playfulness intact. The sight tugged at something deep inside her, a memory of childhood, of brave, reckless caring. She set down her offerings, then moved to sit just outside the open doorway. She spoke softly, words, songs, stories. She recited lines from books she'd loved, whispered promises to the darkness. Sometimes she fell silent, listening to the rhythm of the wolf's breathing. This night, something changed. The wolf, slow and deliberate, stood and limped toward the bowl. She lapped water, then pushed the food to the pups with a gentle nudge. One brave pup ventured close to the threshold, sniffing at Sarah's outstretched hand. Their eyes met. A flash of connection before the pup retreated to safety. Sarah watched, academic and emotional all at once. The cyclus of giving and receiving had softened the wolf's posture. No longer constant defense, but a wary permission. The growling, so dominant the first days, faded to low rumbles only when Sarah stood too fast or reached too far. She remembered the veterinary forums she'd managed to scour when her phone allowed. Wolf wounds, do's and don'ts, home remedies. The most cited advice was patience. Do not invade. Let trust build, molecule by molecule. An animal would die before risking her young. And yet, if the infection worsened, the outcome was guaranteed. Sarah resolved to see more, to press past fear. As she sat hour after hour, she shifted her body until her line of sight allowed glimpses of the wolf's injured leg. The infection was unmistakable, reddened, swollen, balding in patches, streaked with dull pus. The wolf was losing strength day by day, giving up her limited shares for the pups, hiding pain beneath maternal loyalty. Knowing that waiting could mean death drove Sarah to new rituals. She brought a stack of old towels, bottle of peroxide, aspirin, a battered scarf she thought might serve as a gentle leash one day. Though she dared not use it yet. She sat, tools arrayed in the circle of her lap, rehearsing the steps she might take, should the wolf allow. The next day, she experimented, sitting closer, maintaining a steady stream of placating words. She described city life, dreams of Seattle, heartbreak, rebirth, all the fragments of self she couldn't share with a human soul. She watched for changes. A week passed in this dance. Offerings, observation, retreat. The wolf's vigilance remained, but her aggression faded. Sometimes she lay down facing the open door, her eyes heavy, trusting even through exhaustion. One afternoon, as the wind clawed at the corners of the house, Sarah risked moving her hand through the crack, fingers holding a piece of cooked turkey. The pup, the black one, bold, splintered the distance, tugged at the meat, then looked back and forth between mother and human. Sarah didn't move, barely breathe. For a moment, the wolf's gaze was not fierce or frightened, but tired, pleading. "I want to help," Sarah murmured. "I won't cross your line, but soon I may have no choice." When evening came, Sarah sat for hours under the weak bulb, voice nearly gone. The wolf stopped growling at her presence altogether, sometimes even licking her own paw in surrender to fatigue. On the 6th day, Sarah leaned against the doorframe, pulse racing, as she watched the wolf stand, limp forward, and, without snarl or warning, eat while Sarah spoke in gentle tones. The pups played, wrestling, oblivious to the significance of their mother's tolerance. That night, Sarah felt the truce had grown fragile but real. She could do more tomorrow. Tomorrow, she would try. Sarah stood over the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through frosted glass, turning motes of dust into spoonfuls of gold. Her fingers worked nervously, unraveling a battered first aid kit she'd found wedged under the bathroom sink. Peroxide, gauze pads, a few adhesive strips, medical tape, aspirin, a set of mismatched gloves. Everything she had might just be enough or badly insufficient. Her mind repeated instructions from late-night searches. Pressure, disinfect, protect. She added her own supplies. A thick leather belt to serve as a makeshift muzzle. Wash towels, the softest scarf for gentle restraint. The wolf's condition weighed on her. The infected leg, swollen and slick, was more inflamed every morning, the mother's movements growing weaker, her breaths more labored. Sarah recognized the inevitability in those changes. Time was a luxury neither of them could afford. She set aside the medical kit and turned her attention to food. For today, she had purchased ground beef, a rare treat meant to entice the wolf's trust. She washed her hands in icy water, the temperature biting hard enough to remind her this was not her world, but a borrowed one. Her town shoes, now split and fraying, testified to the speed with which new rolls replaced old ones. She made a plan. She would wait until the wolf began to eat, then inch inside, hands open and visible, voice steady and gentle. Every resource she could muster would be called upon. Not knowledge, not expertise, but patience, observational nuance, slow courage. She rehearsed the process in her mind, over and over, breathing the steadiness she'd practiced for weeks. It took hours for the wolf to show herself. Sarah sat on the floor, her patience met only with the steady click and hum of the house. She talked to the wolf and her pups, her voice rolling softly over broken linoleum, retelling stories of city lights and loss, blending grief into myth and comfort into hope. She recounted a childhood spent reading about wild things, the books she'd lost in her last move, the feelings of being alone and finding meaning in connection, even if it arrived disguised as desperation. She set the meat bowl just inside the door and waited, never making sudden movements, her gaze placed slightly above the wolf's head, a trick she'd learned from a YouTube video about nervous dogs. The wolf crept forward, wary but driven by hunger. She sniffed the bowl and, with remarkable caution, lifted food to her mouth. Sarah kept her distance, her voice a lull. When the wolf was distracted, the moment opened. Slowly, Sarah slipped inside the frame of the doorway, settling herself on the cold floor, 3 meters from the wolf, careful not to look directly at the animal. The wolf registered her approach with a frozen stare, every muscle tense. In her mouth hung a morsel of meat, eyes reflecting the sharp warning that lived in her blood. Sarah set her hands down, palms up, and waited. Minutes blurred by as a cold wind moaned along the eaves. The pups played nearby, their tiny bodies tumbling, their calls soft, the mother's tension holding them close. The room fell silent except for the wolf's heavy breath and Sarah's measured words. She spoke not as a commander, but as an equal, offering the language of peace. I want to help. I won't hurt you. Your pups need you strong. Frozen, both watched the other. Time moved in patches, an hour, then 2. The wolf, exhausted, relaxed by centimeters, never letting her eyes stray. Sarah counted each heartbeat, muscle spasms, the way the pups grew braver, one approaching to sniff the bunched edge of Sarah's scarf and pulling a thread loose. Sarah's own fear simmered, receding gradually as she observed the small victories. The wolf finally returned to her meal, ears tilting to catch the resonance of Sarah's whisper. The growls turned to deep rumbling, warning but not threatening. Encouraged, Sarah inched closer over the course of the next several hours, sliding on the bare floor a single centimeter at a time. The wolf watched, suspicious but willing. With each step, the tension slackened. She could see the outline of old scars along the wolf's ribs, the repeated gesture of lifting her paw to lick the inflamed wound. Sarah's chest tightened. Memories of emergency room visits and exhausted single motherhood flashed in quick succession. The pups grew adventurous. One, curious and fearless, crawled to Sarah's shoe, nose twitching. Sarah did not move, did not reach for the animal, only lifted her hand slightly in universal gesture. "I mean no harm," before withdrawing as the wolf's gaze hardened momentarily. This approach continued. Every movement was deliberate. Sarah allowed silence to do most of the work, letting her proximity become the safe backdrop for play and observation. As darkness approached, the wolf's defenses slackened. Her attention split between exhaustion and hunger. Sarah carried on, voice low and encouraging as she closed another inch. She remembered childhood tales of pioneers, survival stories, and the ways people learned to speak the language of animals. Quiet, unfinished prayers that filled the spaces between caution and hope. When the wolf's focus on Sarah reached peak tension, Sarah stopped, withdrew, and reset the day's routine. Each failed proximity was not a defeat, but a lesson. She spent hours journaling, describing responses, documenting the wolf's postures and body language. The day ended with the wolf eating her fill, the pups content, the boundaries narrowed. Not erased, but crossed, step by patient step. The price of trust hung palpably in the air, the distance between two worlds shrinking, punctuated by trembling hands, hopeful eyes, and the silent promise of more to come. The next morning broke heavy and colorless, snow threatening on the horizon. Sarah awoke early, her nerves sharpened by the storm outside, and the sense that time was running thin. She spent more than an hour reviewing her medical kit, rehearsing movements, calm, gentle, deliberate. She made a muzzle from the leather belt, threading it through an old metal loop so she could secure it gently, should the wolf allow. She tucked extra bandages and peroxide in her pockets, wrapped herself in her thickest sweater, and spent several minutes simply breathing, preparing her voice for the ritual of reassurance. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of cold beams and the soft patting of the pups as they played in their room. Sarah allowed herself a moment to watch them, daylight creeping across their fur. Three little hearts, bold and hungry. The mother lay curled, the pain visible, but her eyes calm was a testament to exhaustion, trust, or both. The food this morning was richer, chunks of ground beef and chicken, arranged near the threshold. Sarah entered slowly, holding her hands up, talking in the calmest tones she could manage. She waited long minutes as the wolf watched her every breath, finally approaching the food with obvious caution. As the wolf ate, Sarah began her approach, moving in short, slow bursts with her knees brushing the cold ground, her medical kit in sight, always keeping her gaze soft and indirect. She murmured gentle words, old country songs, lullabies that had once brought comfort in another life. The wolf, now more trusting, paused at the sight of Sarah, encroaching past the usual boundary. Her muscles tensed, her jaw stiffened around a strip of meat. The pups, curious, crowded near their mother. One even reached for Sarah's hand before being nudged back. For a long time, nothing but breath and heartbeat filled the frozen air. Sarah stopped just short of the wolf, settling on the floor without meeting her gaze. Minutes passed, long stretches of silence broken only by the wind rattling window glass. Sarah watched the wolf's eyes, saw the fight playing out in their gold depths. Defense, then calculation, then something like reluctant acquiescence. She began her work, slow and transparent, retrieving the peroxide, showing it to the wolf, narrating every step. She leaned forward, extending her arm, fingers steady, her other hand ready to pull back if needed. The wolf tensed, growling low but not attacking, eyes locked on Sarah's every gesture. Sarah's arms stretched further, and she began to clean the wound. The wolf flinched at the cold touch, rapid breaths misting in the room's chill. She whined, a thin, almost childlike sound, and panted in apprehension. Sarah poured peroxide on the inflamed tissue, watching the yellow foam blossom, pus and old blood escaping the broken skin. The pain was obvious. The wolf attempted to pull her leg away, but was too weak, her body torn between fear and the trust that had been built inch by inch over days and nights. Sarah spoke soothing words, her voice low and constant, a barrier against uncertainty. "It's all right, beautiful. I'm almost done. You're safe, I promise." Bandaging came next, an awkward, tense process of wrapping stained fur with clean gauze and tape. The wolf's breathing accelerated, her body vibrating with the effort not to bolt. Sarah's hands worked fast, remembering her mother's old guidance for injured pets. Talk to them, make them safe, do everything in rhythm with their breath. The pups sensed something was happening. Their play stilled, and they gathered close, eyes wide and silent, the thin line of trust holding mother and human together. As Sarah finished, she let the wolf's leg go, backing away slowly, never turning her back. The wolf immediately lowered her head, licking the wound, testing the new sensation of protection. Sarah retreated to the edge of the room, her hands still trembling, heart racing. The wolf watched her, eyes less cautious, more measuring, the scales between worlds growing lighter. She pressed herself against her pups, settling into rest with a sigh that filled the room with ancient relief. For the first time, Sarah felt the enormity of what had passed. She had crossed the invisible boundary, her hands marked by hope and pain, the small victory written into the warmth she felt as she sat in silence. The wolf had not attacked, had chosen trust over fear, however momentarily. The room, so long a prison, now felt like something else entirely, a refuge, a truce. Sarah gathered her supplies, packed the remnants of her fear away. She spoke quietly to the wolves, those stories from her city life transformed in the telling, bearing a new cadence. One stitch from risk and reward, from patience and understanding. She stood before leaving, and the wolf watched her go, head lifted, eyes following her every motion. A connection trembling and new, but real. Later, by the fireplace, Sarah could not stop her hands from trembling. She wrote every detail in her journal, trying to capture the fragile grace of the day, the way the pups had watched, the way the wolf had allowed her to help. She made plans for tomorrow, knowing each small step might mean the difference between life and death, hope and loss. The price of trust was clear, a boundary not just of fear, but of compassion met in silence, in broken rooms, in the soft breathing of a wild creature learning that the world might yet give kindness. Sarah woke into silence, not the hush of routine dawn, but a hollow, muffled world. She lay a moment beneath the pile of thrifted quilts, fingertips tingling with cold, senses sharpening to the unfamiliar absence of noise. The wind was gone. The pipes had stopped groaning. No birds called, no distant vehicles hummed. Everything seemed held in breathless pause. The living room was gray with dimming light, the kind that betrays snowfall before you ever look outside. She shuffled to the front window, rubbing fog from the glass, and stared as her suspicions confirmed themselves. The world had changed overnight. White blanketed every surface, for inches at least, maybe more. The porch posts wore sugary caps. The empty yard stretched endless and clean, all messes erased by the impartial hand of winter. Inside, the cold felt heavier. Sarah moved quickly, stacking logs into the fireplace and coaxing out flames that flickered stubbornly, refusing to conquer the night's chill. She wrapped herself in layers and set about her first task, taking stock. The pantry shelves sagged with the weight of little: 2 cans of soup, a box of rice, 1 sleeve of crackers, a pound of dry beans. Her fridge hummed, possessing chicken scraps, 2 carrots, creamer, and half a dozen eggs. She tallied quietly, anxiety blooming. A week's worth of food, if nothing spoiled. The woodpile held for 3 days at best. A flicker of panic. 40 miles to whitefish on roads she didn't trust, a battered truck and tires she doubted in snow. The money left in her account was minuscule, hardly enough for groceries and fuel, let alone repairs or the luxury of comfort. Her thoughts snapped to the wolves. She opened the door to their room, instantly beset by the warmth and scent of living bodies. The mother wolf, now less gaunt, raised her head in greeting. The 3 pups, bold and playful, tumbled over one another, fur bristling with health. The food Sarah had left overnight was gone. Not even crumbs remained. She knelt beside the cracked doorway. "Good morning, you beautiful things," she whispered, offering what hope she could conjure. She laid out scraps: chicken, a bit of rice, sour bread, and fresh water. The mother wolf ate sparingly, nudging morsels toward the pups, her strength slowly returning but not yet whole. Sarah watched the choreography of survival play out, maternal instincts overriding even personal hunger. The wound wrapped in Sarah's careful bandages looked less angry, but infection lingered, a shadow not easily outrun. She resolved to repeat her treatments in the coming days, making plans to find real antibiotics when she could get to town. Hours passed. Sarah moved through her routines, checking windows, adding extra layers of plastic to insulate, shifting boxes of books to block drafts. The world outside was silent, snowfall cushioning every sound and masking the broken chorus of her house. Mid-morning, she made an inventory, writing everything out, rationing in columns, calculating meals for herself and her unlikely family. She counted stacks of firewood with new precision, checked beneath the porch for any hidden reserves, and cursed herself for not gathering more in the days before the snow. She felt the pressure of responsibility acutely. The wolves needed food, and soon they would require more. Their appetites grew with each day. The mother, though recovering, would not survive without help. Sarah weighed her options, risked the drive to town with dwindling resources and uncertain weather, or stay, conserve, and hope for a break in the skies. The prospect of leaving the wolves alone chilled her more than any Montana wind. She watched the pups, now nearly 2 months old, play, fighting, testing balance, nipping ears and tails. The smallest one climbed atop its siblings, barking a toothless challenge. Their mother watched, ears turned, body still, face reflecting growing calm. Sarah sensed the change. Trust grew, slow and steady as frost, knitting them into a fragile unit. Midday brought a change in purpose. Sarah fussed in the wolves' room, practicing opening the small window for better air. The mother watched, but did not interfere, her gaze softer than before. A fresh wind swept in, clearing the rank air and filling the space with a bright bite of cold. Sarah left the wolves with a bucket of water, an extra blanket, and promised to return shortly. Resolved, she dressed herself in every warm thing she owned: double jeans, triple shirts, a snow coat, and loaded her truck with spare fuel, her last cash, an old axe, and the shopping list she'd been building in her journal. She gave the wolves one final look before slipping out, hoping she had done enough. She navigated the snowy road slowly, tires slipping as she worked through drifts and icy corners. The world was hushed, powder swirling over fields and forests. At the edge of Whitefish, headlights reflected off untouched snow in the grocery lot, a beacon of civilization after days in silent isolation. Sarah shopped quickly, heart racing, with the urgency of someone who suspected her luck would not last. She bought what she could: kibble, sausage, rice, canned meals, antibiotics, fire starters. At the last moment, she added rawhide bones for the pups, comfort items among the essentials. She filled the truck with a double dose of fuel, bought extra logs for firewood, and drove the journey back almost entirely in darkness. The house loomed welcoming, lights flooding out over the snowdrifts. Sarah hurried inside, supplies clattering, anxious that something had gone wrong. She raced to the wolf's room, heart in her throat. But all was well. The mother wolf lifted her head. The pups squealed and whined, racing towards Sarah with bright, damp noses. One licked her hand, another pawed at her jeans, moments of joy erupting in the quiet return. The house, newly stocked, seemed briefly to fill with warmth and ease. Sarah fed the wolves, laid extra logs in the stove, and allowed herself a few moments by the fire. The family she rebuilt around herself, living on 2 legs and 4, felt more real than any she'd known before. As the night fell, the snowfall thinned, moonlight pooling in the yard. The weight of responsibility grew lighter, shifting toward a bond deeper and more vital than hunger or cold. For the first time, Sarah saw not only danger in the world outside, but the outlines of hope, drawn in paw prints and playful howls. The quiet after Sarah's return didn't last. The next morning, she woke bone-tired, her hands still raw from hauling sacks and splitting logs in the last stormy hours. The world outside her window glistened, icicles growing thick along the gutters, snowdrifts pressed against the door. She stretched, inhaling cold that made her cough, then began her familiar rounds: fire, stove, water, the slow, careful play of keeping her little world intact. In the wolves' room, the air buzzed with a new energy. The pups, fatter now, with rounded bellies and tufts of winter coat, chased one another in loops, scattering scraps of old quilts and gnawed bones. Their mother lay near the open window, eyes closed but ears rotated in perpetual guard. Sarah approached, and the wolf gave her a look that stopped short of mistrust, something softer, worn by healing. Sarah loaded the stove, chopped extra wood, and checked her ration lists. There would be enough food for all if she was smart and careful. She felt the weight of numbers on her shoulders: a week's groceries, 3 days' logs, nearly empty cash. The pressure throbbed in her temples, but for the first time, she felt she could survive it. A new rhythm had taken root, every moment filled with purpose. As the pups grew more active, the challenges multiplied. Food vanished faster, water bowls emptied in hours. The space began to feel tight, even through Sarah's eyes. She wondered, how long until they'd outgrow these walls? Until instinct called them outward? For now, her focus was simpler: safety, warmth, routine. The days grew shorter, each dusk arriving before she was ready. Sarah spent more hours in the wolves' room, mending cracks, sealing windows, arranging old sweaters and towels as makeshift bedding. She rotated the furniture so the pups had a place to tumble and play, letting in just enough cold for the world to seem real but not threatening. One afternoon, as she boxed up broken glass from a shattered frame, she saw the mother wolf circle the pups, nose twitching, sensing something even Sarah missed: the faintest scent of the wild, maybe or just the intuition born from seasons of survival. Sarah took a breath and opened the small window further. The wolf stretched, sniffing the air, then, after a wary beat, lay back down, unbothered. This trust, delicate and earned, marked a turning. Sarah no longer feared each interaction, no longer wondered if she would be met by teeth or flight. The wolf let her open doors, carry water, even clean around the nest. The pups watched everything, learning not just from their mother, but from her, their two-legged stranger. She saw, too, her own attachment growing strong and knotty as winter roots. A day was marked not just by hours or chores, but by simple exchanges. The light in a pup's eyes, the soft bark that greeted her in morning, the wet nose pressed to her hand in quiet thanks. The loneliness that had gnawed at her since Ben left now felt, surprisingly, like a small prize for this fragile family built on patience and the most basic kind of mercy. Once, while clearing space for her woodpile near the wolf's room, Sarah caught herself humming, a low, contented drone that rose without thought. She realized she hadn't sung in months, maybe years, since her last Christmas alone in Seattle. The sound seemed to comfort the pups, and their mother, listening, simply watched Sarah's hands at work. As the days passed, Sarah tried reopening the window more often. She wondered if the world outside might soon call to the wolves as it called to her. A whisper of wildness, maybe, or just the pull of change. One stubborn night, Sarah sat by the fireplace, jotting down bookkeeping notes, when she heard the smallest commotion from the wolf's room. Scrabbling claws, a muffled yip, the creak of a loosened window frame. Heart pounding, she hurried in. She found a mother wolf perched beneath the gap in the window, head lifted, nose tilted toward the crisp night. Sarah froze, unsure if this was an escape attempt or simply longing. But the wolf only looked back at her, eyes wise and settled with her pups curled tight against her belly. Trust, fragile as spun glass, held for another day. The next morning, Sarah discovered the window had been nudged open further. An invitation, perhaps, or a sign. She reinforced the frame, added weather stripping, and left extra food by the sill, as if preparing for a journey yet unnamed. The weeks slipped by, each day trembling closer to true winter. The night before her next planned trip to town, Sarah stayed awake listening to distant wind and to the soft breathing of wolves sharing a place with her, each moment accented by gratitude and quiet promise. When she left for town once more, now bracing for deep cold, she stocked up with renewed confidence. Bags of kibble, sacks of rice and beans, cans of broth, bundles of kindling cut down to fit the wood stove. She returned after dark and burst into the house, half expecting disaster, half hoping for more joy. She was greeted by the pups' yips, the mother's calm stare, and as she kneeled among them, she realized that the sense of responsibility had been transformed into something larger: belonging, family, shelter, love, even with all its quiet, radiant burdens. Silver Point's winter gripped the house in silence, so deep it sometimes felt endless. Each morning, Sarah woke to the hush of snow pressed against the windows, the world outside slow and suspended. Inside, she grew a new kind of rhythm, her days divided between patching cracks in the old bones of the house, tending the stove, and attending to her four companions. She worked methodically, old towels stuffed into window frames, plastic sheeting stretched over loose panes, caulking pressed into every crevice she could find. When the wind rose at dusk, the repairs muffled its voice, letting warmth last a few precious hours longer. The house, still battered, grew more livable, less a tomb, more a barracks filled with the signs of survival. In the wolves' room, the transformation was equally clear. The mother wolf now watched Sarah with calm, or something close to it, eyes lit by gentle curiosity. The pups, growing quickly, had mastered their world. They wrestled, gnawed at shoe soles, tugged Sarah's discarded gloves through the dust. Sometimes, when she worked in the adjoining hall, she felt their gaze upon her, a soft, living thrill that dissolved loneliness. For the first time, Sarah tried an experiment. She left the door ajar as she repaired a blown heater beside their room. At first, only silence, then cautious sniffs. One pup poked a head through, eyes wide, then retreated. 2 minutes later, all three wandered into the hallway, tails raised, ears forward, little conquerors exploring their expanding realm. Their mother followed, slow but unafraid. She paused by the threshold, then stepped into the hall, her injured leg barely hampering her stride. She watched as the pups circled Sarah's feet, sniffed at tools, dug into pockets for hidden treasures. Sarah let them explore, heart thudding, careful to move gently. No sudden gestures, no sharp noises. The mother wolf settled nearby, her body coiled but at rest. This quiet, ordinary moment glimmered with the sense of a powerful peace, the kind that arrives only when the wary agree to put down their burdens, if only for a breath. Sarah sat cross-legged by the old stove, watching pups tumble and mother observe, letting herself believe that what bound them was more than just survival. The day's idleness broke suddenly by a loud knocking at the front door, a heavy, insistent rhythm. Sarah's heart seized. The sound split the peace like thunder. In an instant, she herded the wolves back into their room, urging gently, guiding their rush of fur and tails with whispered urgency. The door closed, Sarah's back pressed against wood as she stilled her panicked breaths. She straightened her clothes, dashed a smear of dirt from her cheek, and made her way to the entrance. Margaret stood on the porch, her face ruddy from cold, arms filled with a bundle of towels and a half-eaten pie. "I saw smoke. Thought you'd need blankets," she said by way of greeting. Her eyes, sharp and shrewd, flicked past Sarah, searching for signs of strange company. "Thank you, Margaret," Sarah replied, struggling for normalcy. "It's colder than I remember." Margaret's gaze lingered. "You hear anything strange at night?" she asked. "Something in the wind. Maybe howling, scratching? Folks around here tell stories." Sarah steadied herself. "Just the old stove fighting back," she lied, the words thick in her mouth. "I got a big dog from Kalispell. She's restless but harmless." The lie tasted sour, but necessity drove her onward. Margaret pursed her lips. "Dog's a good guard if you got something worth guarding. Just hope hunters don't get curious." They traded more small talk, recipes for bread, complaints about fuel prices, rumors of storms. Margaret pressed the pie and towels into Sarah's arms. "Keep warm. And keep an eye out. Hunters coming next week, looking for wolf packs. They get rowdy when they're bored." When Margaret left, the hush returned, heavy but changed. Sarah locked the door, her chest knotted with guilt. She returned to the wolves' room, opened the door quietly. Inside, calm had returned. The pups napped in a tangled heap. Their mother lay beside them, awake but peaceful. Sarah crouched by the threshold, speaking slow comforts. "You're safe," she said. "For now, we're safe." Yet the guilt was sharp. She had lied, spinning cover for her unlikely family, trading truth for security. The burden pressed heavier each day. What if someone found out, called authorities, brought hunters to the door? What dangers lurked not in the wild, but in the hearts of men? She made herself a promise. She would protect the wolves as long as she could. As the afternoon faded, Sarah sat at the cold stove, pups tumbling at her feet, mother wolf dozing nearby. The old house seemed, at last, to hold a new warmth, a tenuous harmony, visible in the way wild eyes met hers without fear. Evening settled over the town, cold blue shadows creeping across patched floors. Sarah moved quietly through her routines, building fires, boiling water, tearing old sheets into usable strips for cleaning and repairs. She watched the wolves resettle in their room, the pups forming a rough circle around their mother, who lay now not in defense, but in watchful repose. The night unfolded slowly, and Sarah found herself drawn to the stove, hunched with a mug of weak tea, listening to the wind rise and fall against the walls. She let the wolves wander, the smallest pup trailing after her, nose pressed curiously to her sock, then bounding away in a tumble of clumsy play. Peace held, tentative but real. Sarah allowed herself this small comfort, a moment's rest before uncertainty would knock again. The next morning, she began a new regime, leaving the wolves' door open whenever she could supervise them, offering scraps, water, and new places to explore. The mother wolf accepted these experiments, more at ease with Sarah's presence, her eyes following without accusation. The pups adopted the house as their own, mapping its corners, sniffing at the unfamiliar objects. An old clock, a shrunken pair of boots, the faded curtains Sarah drew back to bring pale light onto the dusty boards. Each movement was a celebration of their newfound freedom, their mother trailing close, ready to corral with a soft grunt should they stray too far. As days rolled onward, Sarah occasionally found herself sitting at the wood stove, the mother wolf beside her, the pups sprawling at their feet. She marveled at the ordinary miracle of such proximity, how careful patience and faith had stitched together a single shared existence, neither wild nor domestic, but suspended in a hush of belonging. Their routines became rituals, Sarah repairing the walls, sipping tea, reading aloud to the wolves from forgotten novels and battered paperbacks. Sometimes she would sing quietly, voice threadbare but persistent, watching as the youngest pup settled in her lap, eyes closing under the music. The winter outside sharpened, the world growing harder, but inside the house warmth grew thicker. The wolf family slept closer to Sarah's bed, the line between keeper and kept blurring until only necessity distinguished them. The uneasy peace was suddenly broken by another knock, this time more insistent, a fist instead of knuckles. Sarah's heart stuttered. She rushed to gather the wolves, her movement frantic but disciplined. She herded them quickly into their room, closed the door, and smoothed her hair, trying to appear calm. Margaret returned, suspicion alive in her eyes, but this time she stayed longer. She asked more questions about noises, footprints in the snow, distant howls at night. Sarah lied with the same practiced sorrow, blaming the big dog and her loneliness for the restless sounds. Margaret frowned, warning again of approaching hunters. Her words were heavy, their threat immediate. After Margaret left, Sarah sat by the stove, emotions knotted. Every day felt borrowed, every lie a weight she carried. She paced the house, the wolves following, their silent support the only thing keeping her afloat. Days passed. Sarah doubled down on repairs, anticipating the danger. She barricaded the windows, fixed more holes, rationed the firewood. The wolves sensed the change, growing quieter, sticking closer, their play tinged with new caution. One night, after another anxious day, Sarah let the wolves roam near her as she drank tea by the fire. Their mother settled beside her, eyes closed, peace at last. The pups played in half-light, tumbling at her feet, their joyful sounds doing more than any words to reassure her that family, in any form, was worth the risk of danger and the burden of truth. Before sleep, Sarah sat at her workbench, planning how she might protect them if hunters came. She did not know her plan, but knew she would not surrender. She watched the wolves, their breathing steady, their warmth a living shield against the cold and the fears layered thick as snow outside. The invisible thread, woven of loyalty, secrecy, and love, bound her to them now. She knew this, felt it in her bones, and promised herself she would hold fast, whatever threats might come in the days ahead. Cold sharpened itself overnight, settling into the floorboards and walls with a predatory patience. Sarah woke to a gust of frigid air careening through the cracks. The world outside had turned steel gray, ice forming in the corners of the kitchen window, each breath inside almost as bitter as the wind. The thermometer hung by the doorway, read -23 and falling. She shuffled into her morning routine, body aching from the chill and exhaustion. The house felt smaller, hibernation pressing against every surface. She moved quickly, stoking the fire, feeding the wolves, chopping wood outside beneath a bruised sky. The wolves seemed restless too. The pups huddled closer, their play subdued, the mother wolf pacing the room with a cautious energy. By midday, Sarah's energy waned. The cold seemed to gnaw at her bones, sapping her strength. She stacked the stove with extra kindling, layered herself in sweaters and jackets, but neither food nor heat could fully fend off the relentless winter. She felt lightheaded, skin tingling with fever and fatigue. She pressed on, refusing to let the silence swallow her resolve. The wolves needed her, and the fire needed tending. She filled their bowls, watched the mother wolf eat with slow, deliberate bites. The pups clambered around their mother, their usual exuberance muted by the oppressive cold. Outside, the wind picked up, forced snow through gaps in the porch, and howled against the side of the house. Every corner was a challenge, chopping wood with numb fingers, hauling it inside, tending a flame that guttered against ice. Sarah's head throbbed, her face flushed with heat, a sure sign of sickness. She tried to ignore it. She set herself the task of pulling up floorboards in search of leftover insulation, a desperate attempt to trap more warmth. Her arms shook, body feverish, a thin sweat chilling her skin in the draft. The wolves watched her movements, their eyes following as she worked through the pain. At dusk, she collapsed onto the couch, shivering and racked with coughs. The house seemed impossibly large and empty, a cold, echoing landscape she battled alone. She pulled a blanket over herself, promising to get up again in a few minutes for the evening check, for more wood, for more food, always more, never enough. Her thoughts turned foggy. The wolves, her family, her responsibility, lingered in her mind as a constant pulse. She worried about their food, about the next woodpile, about her ability to care for them with sickness pounding through her body. Each breath became a challenge, each movement a test of will. Suddenly, in the haze of fever and fatigue, she felt a shift in the room. The mother wolf approached, not swiftly, not as a predator, but as a presence. Sarah felt the animal's breath warm against her wrist. The wolf's nose pressed gently to her arm, a careful inspection. The pups stayed back, sensing the seriousness of the moment. The wolf lingered, silent, then retreated to the side, settling into a watchful pose near the couch. Sarah slipped in and out of consciousness, sweat cooling and burning, limbs heavy and useless. Time blurred, the whir of wind, the low creak of wood, the steady, patient breathing of her pack. She found herself half dreaming, half awake, lost in images of forest trails and distant howls. She saw the wolves, and herself among them, moving as one through snow-laden fields. She tried to rise, needed to feed them, needed to keep the fire alive, but the effort pulled her down a wave of vertigo and weakness. She fell back against the cushion, tears pricking her eyes, frustration at her own frailty sharp enough to sting. From her half-dream, she felt warmth gathering at her side, a presence heavier than blankets, denser than solitude. The mother wolf climbed onto the couch, pressed her body against Sarah's, a quiet gift of warmth. Her fur was thick, practical, wild, perfectly suited to the kind of cold that now threatened them both. Sarah breathed in the wolf's scent, earthy, strong, a balm against the fever and dread. In that moment, loneliness faded. She was not alone, not entirely. She let herself sink into the warmth, the quiet, the steady heartbeat of the wild creature beside her. The pups lingered at the threshold, peering in with wide eyes. The house, for all its flaws, held the memory of old comforts, warmth, the thrum of breath and heart, a promise of survival in defiance of ice and the howling wind. The night thickened, folding Sarah in and out of uneasy sleep. She drifted on fever dreams, each one tangled with images of endless white, taiga, forest, rivers locked under ice, and the soft padding of wolves at her side. The wind sang in the eaves, shifting through cracks, sometimes carrying far-off sounds she could not name. Sometimes she heard the familiar low whine or the curious, muffled bark of a pup. When Sarah woke, restless, weak, shivering, she found the mother wolf pressed close, her body a shield against the worst of the cold. The pups had settled beside their mother, heads nestled under their paws, a pile of splayed limbs and soft fur. The fire she'd tended so anxiously was burning low, but warmth radiated from the wolves beside her, beating back the chill by inches. For a while, Sarah lay motionless, afraid to move lest she break the spell. Her head swam with pain and relief. She heard the wolf's breathing, steady, rhythmic, softer now, a secure presence impossible to mistake for anything other than care. The boundary between them, so closely guarded all winter, had been crossed. Her companions, once wild and wary, had become protectors in her darkest hour. Outside, frost feathered the window panes. Sarah forced herself upright, clutching the edge of the couch as dizziness rushed in. The fever, fierce as it was the day before, had begun to wane, her skin cool, her mind clearing in small steps. She glanced toward the stove. Only a few embers remained, casting faint orange patterns on the wolf's fur. She tried to stand, but her knees buckled. The mother wolf rose, watched her with intent eyes, then nudged at Sarah's hand. Gentle encouragement, a gesture born not of instinct, but of learning. Sarah smiled weakly, reaching out to stroke the wolf's head for the first time. The fur felt coarse, wild, but warm beneath her palm. The wolf stilled, accepting Sarah's shaky touch, allowing comfort to move both ways. The pups, emboldened by their mother's calm, crawled over Sarah's lap, offering their own kind of support. A paw draped on her arm, a soft whimper, a curious nose nudging an old piece of cloth over her feet. Sarah laughed, a low, ragged sound that dissolved the last of her loneliness that morning. She managed to feed the wolves, water them, and, with halting steps, tend the stove until the house breathed warmth again. Her body remained weak, every task a struggle, but she was no longer alone in it. The wolves didn't leave her side. Throughout that day, Sarah drifted between sleep and waking, her strength gathering in hesitant waves. The mother wolf stayed near, sometimes rising to patrol the room, always returning. The pups grew bolder, one of them dragging a ragged toy, a scrap of old quilt, onto Sarah's chest, pressing it there with earnest charity. She hugged the offering and wept. With evening, The fever broke completely. Sarah sat upright, blanket around her shoulders. Wolves clustered nearby. The air seemed lighter, safer. She wondered how she could ever thank them, how she could repay warmth in a world that so often turned cold. For the first time, Sarah allowed herself to truly rest. She stroked the mother wolf's head again, letting her fingers comb the thick fur, marveling that the animal remained perfectly still, neither flinching nor retreating. The wolf had transformed, no longer simply living, but nurturing Sarah as she had been nurtured. Days passed, and Sarah recovered, strength refilling her limbs slowly. The wolves remained with her, never straying more than a few steps away. She fed them, spoke to them, tended their needs. They reciprocated with silent, unwavering presence. One morning, as Sarah poured water and prepared food, she found herself surrounded, pups at her feet, the mother wolf pressing her shoulder while she worked. The bond was no longer tentative, but complete. It was then, with renewed hope and gratitude, that Sarah reached out fully, stroking the wolf from muzzle to shoulder. The animal leaned into her hand, closing her eyes in a gesture of trust so complete that Sarah knew, at last, they had crossed every invisible barrier. They were for all purposes that mattered, family. When spring's first bite snuck into the air, Sarah pulled back the heavy curtains and watched sunlight glimmer over the last dirty heaps of snow. The wolves were nearly 3 months old now, each day bursting with a new kind of energy, their legs sturdy and wild, their play sprawling through every room she let them have. The mother's limp had faded to almost nothing, health blossoming in her fur and gait. Sarah sat huddled by the stove, making notes in her battered notebook. The time for a decision loomed. 3 pups couldn't remain in her battered home forever, not while the world outside offered them another calling. She felt their restlessness, their need for open space, for a freedom she could never give them within these walls. The wild called to them in ways she could barely fathom. She had recovered fully from her fever, but its aftermath left her reflective, more attuned to signs of change. The wolves, too, had changed. Their play grew wilder, their interest in her counters and furniture waned, replaced by long gazes through the window, ears twitching at every distant sound. The smallest one nudged at the door every morning. The boldest pressed its nose against the glass, yearning for air thick with scents Sarah couldn't name. Within days, news traveled. Margaret brought word that the hunters had arrived, their camp a few kilometers north. Her warning was delivered with a stoic face, but the message was clear. Wolves in the woods meant danger, meant rifles and traps, and men eager to prove themselves. Sarah's internal war grew sharper. She debated keeping them longer, hiding them, crafting barricades, but each night her resolve thinned. The wolves deserved more than shelter and scraps. They deserved to know the world as it was, to learn its sorrows and its wonder. Their mother often stood at the window, watching the thinning snow, her flank pressed to the glass. Sarah spent afternoons exploring the woods, bundled in a stitched coat, boots muddy and cold. She walked the half-hidden trails past Silver Point's edge, searching for a place that could serve as a temporary home, a deserted hunting cabin, a sheltered grove untouched by men or their fears. Every step became a prayer, for safety, for wildness, for something like peace. At last, deep in a patch of pines, she found a winter shelter, an old ranger outpost, half collapsed but dry, tucked beside a stream swollen by meltwater. There was enough cover for the wolves, enough silence for learning, places for food, for scents, for the start of new life. Sarah measured each wall, each patch of ground. She left markers in the snow, familiar rags and bones for the pups, and planned how she might introduce them to their new world. She began a gradual process. First, letting the wolves outside when she could watch them. The mother's pace slow but unafraid, the pups bounding through snowdrifts, yipping in delight at every pine cone and gust of wind. The world was unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Each day stretched longer, the sun warmer, the lure of freedom closer. Their mother never wandered far, always circling, always returning to Sarah's side. She looked back with wild eyes, a question in every glance. Is it time? Are we ready? Sarah's heart ached with the weight of choice. She wanted to hold them, to keep them safe, but knew, as the days grew longer, she needed to let go. Love, she realized, was not the warm candle she used in winter. Love was cold sometimes. Love meant letting those she cared about meet danger and joy on their own terms. She waited for her chance, a day when the sky was clear, when the hunters seemed distant, when the wolves, restless and hungry, pressed their noses to the crack in the door and whined softly for something more. On the chosen morning, Sarah let sunlight pour through the living room, turning the thinning snow to glistening patches of mud and moss. She opened the front door wide, heart pounding so hard she feared the wolves would sense her turmoil and retreat. Instead, the mother wolf stepped out first, her nose high to catch the wind, muscles sculpted beneath a pelt restored after long months of healing and caution. The pups bounded into the yard, slipping and sliding in the remnants of ice, their bodies ecstatic with freedom. Sarah followed, watching as the wild began to take hold. Their play stretching out beyond the confines of four walls, their ears pricked to new sounds. A jay cackling in the bare aspens, distant branches cracking, the rumble of a hidden stream. The world was so much larger than the small, battered house that had sheltered their family. The mother wolf wandered only a short distance before glancing back, amber eyes meeting Sarah's. A question sparked, familiar and painful. Was this goodbye, or only the beginning of new learning? Sarah walked ahead, calling softly, and a little pack followed. She led them along the edge of Silver Point, away from the crusted road and chatter of distant engines, through a thin grove where their paws barely marked the soil. She paused often, letting the wild settle into their bones, watching the way instinct pulsed beneath puppy joy. The mother stayed close, never letting the pups stray, her gaze sweeping the landscape, alert to the movement of clouds and shadow. For hours, Sarah shepherded the family deeper into forest until the winter shelter, her secret discovery, came into view. The ranger outpost, battered but strong, stood waiting by the trickle of the spring. Sarah knelt, arranging bits of food and scraps of familiar cloth by the doorway, marking the threshold with the sense of home. The wolves explored cautiously at first, noses to the ground, ears fluttering at every new noise, bodies pressed close as they slipped into the shadowed interior. Their mother entered last, sniffing the beams and corners, testing every surface. Sarah sat outside in the cold, listening for signs of comfort. A ragged pile forming in the darkest corner, a sigh, the thump of a pup chasing a stray pine cone. Sarah stayed until dusk threatened, watching the little family settle. She spoke gently through the half-open door, explaining in her softest voice that this new place meant safety, meant learning, meant freedom, however uncertain or wild. The mother wolf's eyes, dark and wise, lingered on Sarah as if to acknowledge something shared, something finished. When Sarah finally turned to leave, it was with a weight in her chest she had never known before. Joy threaded with grief, the ache of letting go etched into every step. The walk home was long. The wood seemed both full and empty, every bird's song sharper in the cold. That night, She worried. Would they return? Would the wild take them away completely? Or would the threads of belonging hold? She set food near the back door, left a blanket near the porch, and waited, sleep broken and uncertain. The next day brought no sign. She returned to the outpost, walking slowly, calling, voice high and frail in the brittle air. The wolves were gone, exploring, hiding, learning what it meant to belong to the woods. Sarah left more food, spoke more words, then sat beside the stream with her notebook on her knees. She told herself this was right. She repeated it in cadence with the water, with the wind, until the truth settled deep and solid inside her. Each evening that week, she returned to the outpost, sometimes finding the family curled inside, sometimes only the scattered remains of a meal. The pups grew bolder, their mother more relaxed, the rhythm of life changing from safety to stretching, and unspooling, letting go. Then, one afternoon, as Sarah approached, the pups bounced toward her, tails like banners. Their mother hung back, searching her face. Sarah knelt, hands open, and the mother allowed herself to be touched. Just once, a brief caress, a silent thank you, an acknowledgement that everything had changed and become something more. As spring came closer, Sarah realized the moment was ending. It was time to let go more fully, to let the wild claim what was always meant to be free. The ritual of letting go became its own season. Each morning, Sarah packed a canvas tote with food, rags, a battered field guide, and trekked out to the ranger outpost, her boots leaving clear prints over thawing snow and splotches of dark mud. The forest sang with the returning birds. The wind no longer threatened but beckoned, a call, a challenge, a kind of promise. The wolves, now growing taller and leaner, awaited her not at the threshold, but among the trees. Sometimes she glimpsed a flash of sleek fur between the trunks, the boldest pup bounding toward her with a yip too ragged to still be puppy. Sometimes only quiet followed, the outpost empty, food untouched, the silence pregnant with new stories being written far from her eyes. On days when the pack gathered, she watched their mother carefully. The old wariness had bled away, replaced with the calculating patience of a matriarch teaching lessons that would last a lifetime. Sarah saw her stalk mice in the brush, leading the pups in slow, measured gestures, paw lifted, ears back, weight shifting, then a sudden lunge. She watched as pups missed, then tried again, until finally one snagged a squirming creature between sharp, muddy teeth. The victory was celebrated in soft nips, in brief yips that disappeared among leafless branches. Sarah became teacher in her own way. She brought pots and pans, banged them together, clapped and stamped. Her voice raised not in anger, but as lesson. Beware noise, beware humans. She tossed rocks gently past hiding places, imitated shouts and laughter, reenacted the sharp rattle of plastic bottles, the dull thud of boots in snow. Each rehearsal left the wolves more wary, pups darting for cover, the mother leading them to safe hollows, never panicking but always moving. The line between nurture and release sharpened as days passed. Sarah left less and less food, forcing the wolves to hunt, challenged their instincts, reminded herself with every action that this transition was essential. At dusk, she watched them from a safe vantage, pups patrolling the old outpost, noses down, tails level with their backs. She saw the moment, clear and true, when a rabbit flashed across the clearing and the entire family gave chase. No confusion, no hesitation, only muscle and memory honed into quickness. Some nights she returned home alone, carrying only the field guide and a heart heavy with quiet pride. She sat writing by candlelight, describing the day's lessons, cataloging progress. First successful hunt. First time the pups ignored her arrival. First sign that dependence had been replaced by wild certainty. Spring's slow surge raised the river, green buds dotting every patch of scrub. One evening, Sarah arrived at the outpost to find only tracks, wolf prints leading away from the door, straight into the deep woods. That night, she barely slept, worry and hope tangled in every thought. By morning, she returned, her hope fragile but alive. The wolves were gone for hours, then, at dusk, appeared among the trees, mouth stained, eyes bright with the distance traveled and the food found. The mother approached Sarah, head tilted, pausing close but never too close. In her posture, Sarah read uncertain gratitude, a promise that, though the thread between woman and wolf now stretched, it held, unbroken, invisible, eternal. Each day, Sarah repeated her lessons. She reduced rations, mimed dangers, let her hands grow rough from hauling, from hiding, from gently pushing the wolves away. The pups flourished, the mother grew strong, and the rituals of parting set in with every rising sun. When at last Sarah came and found the wolves distant, watching her from the edge of the clearing, unwilling to approach, she understood her role was ending. She left food one last time, sat quietly with open notebook, and watched from the brush. The family formed a hunt, silent, coordinated, whole, and as dusk bled purple along the horizon, Sarah closed the field guide and stepped softly home. She did not look back, trusting that she had given what she could, and knowing the rest belonged to the forest, to the wild, to the lineage whose name she would never know, but whose lesson she would remember in her heart, always. Spring's thaw lingered in Silver Point and in Sarah's chest, a restless ache shaped by absence and the tender memory of wild paws in her hands. She kept routine through mornings silent with possibility, gathering offerings of food, but increasingly leaving baskets empty, save for bone or feather. The wolves rarely returned now, but their tracks filled her days, a fresh arc in muddy ground, a scatter of fur caught on a branch, the mark of claws crossing a patch of last snow toward the deeper woods. For many days, she allowed herself only hope, writing notes in her old field guide, tallying sightings, mapping prints and patterns like love letters to creatures who no longer needed her. Yet every night, she lingered by the outpost, waiting until shadows swallowed all certainty. One dusk, she found herself walking the old trail from her house to the ranger shelter, not expecting bodies but content with memory. The woods were alive. A fox darted across her path. The jay called in warning, and the wind carried the voices of everything unclaimed by humans. She walked slowly, sat cluster-backed by birches budding at last, and listened to silence bloom. She approached the outpost, and, for a long time, saw nothing but moss and darkness. Then, at the limit of vision, she glimpsed motion, 3 wolves, grown lean and powerful, playing quietly among last year's leaves. Their mother circled, making rounds, ever the center of their small orbit. Sarah felt pride, regret, and gratitude pour through her. She had no right to this reunion, yet it found her all the same. She did not call, did not move close. She watched as the mother led her family through the lesson of distance. Ears up, eyes wary, bodies low beneath every sound. For a time, the youngest pup hesitated, turning Sarah's way, tail flicking. But the lesson held. Trust the woods, trust the pack, keep clear of human scent. The next morning, she left food, not for need, but as a farewell gesture. She spent the evening beyond the clearing, heart a muted symphony, as the wolves hunted through the shadows, a litany of new independence, every movement deliberate and wild. On what would be her final visit, Sarah paused at the clearing, feeling the ache of parting heavy and real. The pack was hunting, silent, together, moving with the grace born of necessity. Their mother tracked a small deer, her body low, breath steady, pups following the path of her tail. The kill, when it came, was sharp and quick. Sarah watched from afar, knowing the lesson. They belonged to the woods now, every skill rendered in muscle, tooth, and caution. She lingered after they vanished, watching the sun slip low behind the pines. She whispered her own goodbyes, her own thanks. She did not cry, nor did she smile, but she felt something whole where there had been longing, a sense of mission fulfilled, a wound given time to heal. That night, at home, she turned the lock, set her journal aside, and prepared herself for the next page in a life remade by the wild and its lessons. The wolves would not come again, not for food, not for comfort. They would remember, perhaps, the shape of her voice or the scent of her coat, but the gift she had given, and been given in turn, was the chance to return to solitude as strength, not as loss. The final lesson from the forest was this: every bond leaves its mark on the world, in quiet places, in muddy tracks, in the pulse of longing on cold spring nights. And the courage to let go was not a surrender, but an offering, a gift as ancient as the woods themselves. Sarah fell asleep that evening with the echo of soft paws stretched across her dreams. A month passed, and the last snows melted in jagged islands scattered across the yard. Sarah stood on her porch, staring out at puddles reflecting the pale gold of sunrise. The forest shimmered in places streaked with fresh green, grass awakening from sleep, the first crocuses pushing through hard earth. She had grown used to the quiet, the absence of wild yips and pattering paws, the silence as profound and endless as a cathedral. The house was hers again, truly hers, a battered haven, now layered in stories no one else could read. She patched holes in a roof and repainted the battered door a bell-clear shade of blue, hopeful and clean as the sky above. She hauled broken furniture onto the porch, splitting it for firewood or hauling it to the curb with a sense of finality. Her hands learned new skills: how to till the frozen soil into loose rows, how to mend a frayed sleeve with careful stitches, how to rest without waiting for a cry in the night. Days tumbled together, marked with lists and plans, garden charts, seed trays set by the window, repairs to fencing, restoring the battered greenhouse behind the shed. The world outside spun faster, pulling her along with the rhythm of growth, of promise, of all things renewed. Sarah kept her journal close, filling its pages with reflections that grew less frantic and more measured. She wrote letters to herself, to the wolves, to the patch of forest where she returned in the evenings to leave a token of food, a faded piece of blanket, or simply a few moments of memory. The writing became more than survival. It was a testament, a bridge reaching backward and forward at once. The villagers watched her with new eyes. Margaret, in particular, softened. On one clear afternoon, the older woman appeared at Sarah's gate, clutching a tin of cookies and a nervous smile. "You've made it through the worst," Margaret said, pouring tea with rumbling hands. Together, they sat in the kitchen, bathed in late sunlight, speaking gently about the season, about broken fences and hardy seedlings. They did not mention wolves, but the space between the words was gentle, a truce built on kindness and quiet understanding. Sarah spoke of the winter in veiled fragments, of tending fires against impossible cold, of finding purpose in small things, of the wild comfort that comes only after deep loss. Margaret listened, eyes filling first with concern, then softening into recognition. By the end of the visit, they were laughing over bad bread and broken shoes, two survivors cradling fragile hope in chipped cups. That night, Sarah stepped outside, watching shadows lengthen beneath the pines. She caught a cluster of prints in the garden, impossibly large, impossibly familiar. Her heart thudded. Moonlight spilled across the threshold as she knelt, tracing each track with trembling fingers. The prints led away from the house, through mud and thin grass, toward the boundary where the woods began again. She followed them in the dusk and found, at the edge of the forest, a gathering. The mother wolf, flanked by three robust shapes, their fur thick and their eyes unblinking. Silence hung between them, a charged waiting, neither wary nor wild, simply present. Sarah stopped, breath caught in her chest. The wolves watched her, then the mother approached, slow and purposeful. She stopped within reach, head tilted, amber eyes reflecting memory. Sarah extended a hand, just once. The wolf pressed her muzzle against Sarah's palm, a gentle touch as light as air. Around them, the world felt endless, fresh shoots pushing upward, breeze rustling new leaves, sky fading to soft violet. The pups circled restlessly, then stilled as their mother waited, something like command lingering in her pose. Sarah closed her eyes, let the moment last. She did not count the seconds, did not measure the significance. She allowed herself simple gratitude for every risk, every freeze, every fever and heartbreak and patient waiting. When she opened her eyes, the wolves turned, fading into the trees one by one. The mother lingered a moment longer. Sarah knew that this was the final gift, the chance not only to save, but to be saved, to transform solitude into connection, sorrow into grace. She walked home through deepening dusk. On the porch, she watched the forest as night crept in, a smile spreading slow and certain across her face, no longer haunted, but ready for whatever the world would offer next. Evening bled behind the pines, turning the world to deep indigo. Sarah lingered in the doorway, the last breath of spring on her cheek. The house behind her was quiet, warmed by a steady fire and the gentle clamor of old utensils. She wandered from room to room, touching objects that had survived both ruin and rescue. Her field guide, the battered mug, the quilt stitched from 4 winters of lost plans. All spoke of something finished and something yearning for more. The season's work made itself felt. Planters crowded the windowsills. The greenhouse gleamed with rows of tomatoes and kale fighting upward toward light. Sarah moved among them, hands dirt cold and skillful, mind unfolding with plans. Irrigation, new fences, a patch of sunflowers to border the old dirt road. The house, once a symbol of isolation, now held the promise of life, each repair and seed a declaration that she belonged here and that here would bloom. Through the days, Sarah wrote more, her journal filling with stories, lessons, the slow wisdom drawn from wolves and winter and her own stubborn heart. She recorded the quiet victories of daily life, the first shoot of lettuce, a cold morning spent mending the porch, the joy of finding the radio still picked up music from distant Helena. Pages grew thick with lists and gratitude, a chronicle of choices, of chapters closing and new ones opening with every sunrise. The evenings returned her to the forest. She took long walks along familiar paths, boots damp from dew, hands open to gather the scent of pine and warming air. Sometimes she found fresh tracks among the grasses, large, deep impressions marking a route from the woods to her steps. She followed when she could, heart steady, quietly content just to belong to the same landscape as those she'd once sheltered. One twilight, Sarah paused at the edge of the woods, the boundary where wildness began. She stood still, listening, each sound a gift of memory and possibility. In the hush, she thought of everything left behind. Her old apartment, the city noise, the scrap of broken love that was smaller now, less bitter, more a shape lost in shadow. Inside, she found herself humming, the tune light and new. She sat at her desk, window open, writing another letter, this time not to the wolves, but to herself. She told the story in careful lines, how every true rescue is mutual, how winter and wildness can teach patience, how her loneliness sharpened into clarity and then softened into acceptance. The sun slipped further behind the horizon, painting the kitchen floor in ribbons of gold and black. Sarah made tea, sat at the window, and watched dusk conquer the yard. She could have cried at the beauty, at the overwhelming fullness of absence. Her heart, for the first time in years, steady and open. A knock echoed at the door, softer than Margaret's but firm. Sarah rose, smoothing her skirt, and opened it to find her neighbor with a basket of sweet rolls and a knowing, gentle look. "Tea," she offered, voice calm as the evening. They sat together, sharing small blessings, speaking not of wolves but of all that had changed, of gardens and green shoots, and a life shaped by choices both bitter and sweet. The night grew deep. Margaret departed with a wave and a promise. Come by for supper, come by for friendship, come by for all things that carry us forward. Sarah watched her go, then turned back indoors, the house now lit with the peace of return. Before drifting to sleep, Sarah caught another print by the door, fresh, clear. She smiled, touched the mark, and went to bed with the window open, letting the scent of earth and possibility drift over her dreams. At dawn, she woke early, standing in her nightdress at the window as the forest came alive. Bird calls, the rustle of small animals, the distant echo of spring thunder. She felt herself part of this chorus, no longer set apart, no longer afraid. Sarah opened her notebook and wrote a new title, Wolf Haven, How We Saved Each Other. She began the first paragraph before the kettle whistled, sunlight streaming in. She did not know if the wolves would come again, or if the family she loved would ever return to linger near the edge of the woods. It did not matter now. What mattered was that she could carry them and herself into the brightness of any new chapter. And as the morning stretched wide before her, Sarah smiled, ready at last for everything still awaiting.